Hey, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. So maybe a quick preamble, which is, David touched on, this is the age of web vitals and sort of performance. Uh, it is never more important to deliver a fast loading and rendering experience on the web, but the industry remains sort of undecided to me in how developers get there. It's about pre-rendered content, it's about dynamic content. My head is spinning. So I'm joined by a number of talented panelists who can help me and us answer this question. We have Rita Kozlov, who is product manager at Cloudflare, specifically on Cloudflare Workers, Guillermo Rauch, who is the CEO of Versel and the co-creator of Next.js, and Katie Sylor-Miller, who is a architect at Etsy. Really just to kick things off, I'd love for you all to just, 60 seconds, tell us about, your work and how it connects to this topic. And I want to start with Rita, and then Guillermo, and then Katie.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Rita. As Ben mentioned, I'm the product manager for Cloudflare Workers, which is Cloudflare's serverless offering. And yeah, I'm really excited about this topic. The way that Workers kind of came to be is that, for such a long time, the way of thought was for your site to be performant, you pushed as many static assets up to your CDN, right? And so we thought, well, what if instead of just static assets, right, and being able to distribute them around the world, the whole purpose of that is to get them as close to the end users as possible so that until we can beat the speed of light, you can get that top performance. And so what if instead of just pushing static assets up, you could run your actual code and application logic near the user?
Cool.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that topic for sure. Guillermo, you want to go ahead really quickly? What is Vercel? What is Next.js?
Yeah, so we're approaching the same problem of making front ends super interactive and super snappy. But we started with Next.js with a framework for React, which 4 or 5 years ago was starting to take off in a really important way. But it's really hard to put all the pieces together. It was really hard to take React and turn it into an actual front end with pages, routing, style systems. Even CSS was hard to put together. So we wanted to deliver a delightful developer experience and then a platform that would, similarly to what Rita is saying, take those assets, take those pages, take the dynamism and the static parts, push it to the edge, and with that same goal of delivering front-end experiences as fast as possible to end users.
Cool. Katie, you've got a different role, sort of a different role here. Can you tell us about your work?
Yeah, so as Ben said, I'm Katie Sylor-Miller. I'm Etsy's front-end architect, and I'm here to kind of provide a perspective as someone who is very deeply in the world of performance as more of a boots-on-the-ground practitioner, someone working at a company who has to kind of take all of these different concerns and balance them, along with things like organizational capabilities and getting buy-in from leadership for perf, actually on the ground figuring out how to fix things. So I'm super excited to really talk about what it's like as a modern day performance practitioner.
Great, thanks everybody. So I want to start with this kind of this question, which is, there's new phones coming out, there's new computers. The phone in my pocket is probably more powerful than the laptop I dragged around 8 or 9 years ago. I'm just making up numbers here, but technology is advancing. We have 5G connections. Why should I care about high performant web experiences? Will the technology just make everything good for me? Katie, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start. So I think the thing that I always try to hammer home for folks about why performance matters still so much is that you have to remember that you're not your users, and not everyone has access to one of those fancy, high-powered devices that we as very privileged, generally software engineers have access to. I don't know if folks have ever heard of the concept of the next billion users, but the idea is that the next billion users are people who, their phone is their primary mode of access to the internet. And a lot of times those are very low powered phones. They're not on super fast networks. So I think as long as we continue to have these problems of like bandwidth and processing power, that it's always going to be an issue. And and I think there's multiple other facets to this as well, that it impacts your bottom line. There's been multiple companies that have come forward and said, we made this performance change and we decided that it has made X impact on improving our conversion rate or our engagement levels, reducing bounces, things like that. And then I think the final piece, which actually there was a big announcement just today from Google, that they look at front-end page performance, especially on mobile, when they decide how to rank you. And they've now made it official that the core web vitals that David had talked about are going to be considered part of their ranking algorithm, I think starting in May of 2021. So there's a lot of different ways that perf is incredibly important to your business.
Agree, disagree? Anyone want to jump in on that topic, or is it just a thumbs up across the board?
I definitely thumbs up, and I wanted to add. So on the subject of the next billion users, yes, their hardware is nowhere near as powerful as perhaps what some of us are used to. I just got my iPhone 12, so I'm really excited about it. But at the same time, like don't get used to this because it's too powerful. It's too good. Single-threaded JavaScript performance on this is like 100 times better. Again, inventing numbers here, but it is a very significant, delta with the average phone of the world. And I actually just ordered it, what many people consider to be the average phone in the world. It's a Xiaomi Redmi phone, $140 on Amazon. I want to train myself to like test the web always on that device and be more sympathetic towards the next billion users, and even like, the existing billions of users that have less powerful phones for rendering those powerful front end. So that's one thing I wanted to add. And the other one is, this is known also as Page's law, Wirth's law, where, software is getting slower, faster than hardware is getting faster. So even on iPhone, when a page has all this competing code from third-party scripts, oversized images, video plays, tracking scripts, ads, trackers, all that stuff, it's a very complex world on that front end side. And even the fastest and best hardware cannot keep up. So looking at web vitals and understanding them from the perspective of your user, that's how we can sort of simplify a little bit of this world and say, like, this page is good, this page is not good, but it's tough.
The other thing about the next billion users too, and is where they are, right? And this is maybe kind of a biased point of view, but yeah, they're likely not in the United States. They might be in South America or India, or we're seeing Africa coming online more and more, right? And so first of all, the devices might be weaker, but also they're further away from the centralized regions where compute is today, which is primarily like very much US East 1, as we all know it, right? And even if you take your fancy iPhone, like as soon as you leave the United States, you start to notice how much slower everything is, despite the super powerful hardware.
This is true. I'm temporarily in Canada right now on a US phone plan, and I have some tethered connection, and it's very, very frustrating. And I didn't even consider that possibility. As a side note to this, so I think that everyone can relate to the idea that there are billions of handsets of varying degrees. There's people all over the world, and we don't do enough to consider them. But let's say, I'm a capitalist. I only care about my users here in North America. Is a reason I should care. I see a trend developing where performance is becoming a differentiator in the marketplace for almost like new products, right? No one's going to use Jira and say, wow, this is so fast. What a great experience. But we are seeing a wave of products. Linear is one that's popped up as a to-do app that advertises its speed. Guillermo, I've used Versel, and I've commented that even just that experience is really fast and pleasant. I want to, run with this. Is this, am I wrong? Is this an emerging trend or not?
Yeah, I think even in the US, I think things are pretty bad in the front end world. Just I wanted to make that clear because we've all witnessed what it's like to load a page on a mobile device and see, you know, a GDPR pop-up, shift all the layout. That's where one of the Web Vitals cumulative layout shift becomes really important, because you have all this competing interest in this front end, you know, things that the marketing team has added in terms of analytics, ads, content that comes in later, earlier. That's why one of the topics of the panel with regards to like static versus dynamic, sometimes, you know, we shoehorn a static solution into what's a very dynamic world, and we hate, we basically hurt a lot of the Web Vitals in the process. So I would agree with you that even if you're just focusing in the US, there's so much work to do to get performance to be optimal. And lots of business concerns as well that come in mind with regards to personalization. So funny enough, I recently had a delightful shopping experience on Etsy where it had prioritized Apple Pay as a payment mechanism. I don't know if I was in a cohort, an experiment, whatever. I was buying a mask and it was delightful. I was reminded of how important it is to personalize for each user. And that's where, you know, some of this dynamic computation at the edge becomes more important. The ability even to just experiment more on the front end side. So performance is this kind of constant battle with an evolving product and evolving requirements. And that's true for every market.
I think that point about personalization is really important because as we're layering on more things like machine learning, personalization, all of these things take time on the server. So there's kind of this tension between, you know, the more work that we do on the server to make a better experience for our users, the slower they're going to get it, and everyone has a threshold beyond which they're not going to stick around. And you know, even in the United States, the more that you're trying to do to make your experience more personalized is pushing you closer and closer to being over that time boundary, you know, and you have to kind of look at things holistically and figure out like, how do we make space for this by speeding things up in other places?
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the need or the market demand for fast experiences. I want to talk a little bit about the technology. And I'm gonna add a little boring story time. So one of my first jobs was I actually worked for Four Seasons Hotels and Resorts, not the landscaping company, on their webpage for the marketing team. And this was circa 2005 or 2006. And they had a in-house programming language, okay, you know, like not undocumented, a PDF told you how to use it, or probably wasn't even a PDF, but it was built around a very elaborate publishing system that cascaded includes, so that if somebody made an edit to one piece of the marketing page, it generated, you know, it created a graph and it generated a tree of HTML files that got published and served over the web. That was 2005 or 2006. And I think even then it was, you know, it had been around for years. And I'm starting there to say, you know, pre-generating content, going pure server side. As an industry, you know, Jamstack is popular again. That approach that I just described from 15 years ago is in vogue again. As an industry, we can't seem to make up our mind about what is the best approach for delivering content to users in a way that is performant. And so I want to, you know, like, is there an answer today? Have we decided on this? Rita, I want to go to you.
Yeah, there's absolutely an answer. There's one way to do things. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. It's really interesting, I guess, from my vantage point, because I get to see everyone's different configurations and like where they're at in their journey. And so I think what's commonly referred to today is like dynamic sites, right? Is you do a lot of the generation on the server, and even for a relatively static web page, you still have to make calls to the database, all that. And so the idea, as I mentioned earlier, for a long time was kind of to, okay, well, let's see if we can cache it. And then you got into all of this trickery of, well, I sometimes have signed in users. How do I handle that? And most of the pages may be static, but other parts of it need to be dynamic. And yeah, it's been interesting kind of seeing, I think more and more what I see is people are building statically generated websites, but then using things like functions to supplement them and create these dynamic experiences. And I think the real benefit of that model, like there's no right or wrong, right? There's like a spectrum of what works really well for you. But I think the real benefit of that model is how simple it is and how scalable it is, which to like Dave's point in his keynote, right, like means less ops on your team and more time spent building new features.
From our perspective, what we've done with Next.js is try to kind of give best of both worlds type approaches to people, because as Rita says, there's legitimately good reasons for pages that are truly static to be deployed as a static artifacts, because then your ops overhead goes down dramatically. I always say, you know, what's better than computation close to the user or computation, serverless computation, is no computation at all, because you've been able to do the computation once and then share it with a large cohort of users and then push it to the edge. And as you say, Ben, that was like cool in 2005. I think what's cool now is that we have frameworks that you can actually go and say, oh, this part is static. And I, as a developer, am becoming aware of the infrastructure that my code causes as a consequence, which is really cool. It's like you develop and then infrastructure happens as a consequence. But it's too simplistic, right? And I think our job is not to try to like make our life super optimal, but make our users' life, it's a good balance of making users' lives optimal as well. And when things become more dynamic, you start pushing a lot of computation to the client side, and then you kind of lost all this amazing cloud computational capability to move that computation to, you know, not drain users' battery lives and paint the content they're interested in faster. And that's why I'm such a big fan of Web Vitals as your kind of measuring stick for, should this be static, should this be dynamic, should I use how much client-side code versus how much edge code versus how much origin code. Code is going to be everywhere, and that I think is not going away or slowing down. But our understanding can be, well, am I painting the content that this user needs fast? Am I shifting the layout? How fast is the interaction? So I'm impressed with what Google has put out with Core Web Vitals. And as Katie said, it's going to become a big part of SEO rankings. So I think as an industry, we're all going to have this moment of reckoning. But that's just the SEO experience, right? Like that's Google consuming your content. And the reality is that if I'm a returning user and I'm coming back to fourseasonslandscaping.com and I've already done a lot of shopping, I want to be presented recommendations and my browsing history and so on, and I want to access those fast. And that kind of goes counter to that pre-rendering model. So the answer is both, really, and you have to have frameworks, like hybrid frameworks, that account for that.
Katie, I want to, you know, Rita and Guillermo, you know, they're working on services. You know, they're living in the future. They're living in a world where everybody's holding hands across the earth to create one human chain of peace. You work at Etsy, and you know, how real are these techniques for someone like you in a big, huge web product, huge web presence? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think actually, so the interesting thing for us is that we're taking a lot of these concepts that really Next.js is founded on, but because we have this, you know, 12-year-old monolith of PHP code that's like extremely robust and really well understood, captures all the features, you know, it's really, really difficult to kind of take a fully greenfield approach where we throw everything out and rewrite it completely in React. So, you know, we've taken this hard look at dynamic content on the server versus dynamic content on the client and said, we're putting a stake in the ground that we're prioritizing our users over our developer experience. And we think that serving pages from the server that are completely built, that come really fast from the server, That's always going to be the fastest and best way to provide a really good loading and performant experience for our users. However, you know, our 12-year-old jQuery code, when it comes to being able to have really great and like natural and fluid dynamic interaction on the client, just isn't up to snuff. And we went well beyond what jQuery was capable of many years ago. So we've started taking this hybrid approach where in our PHP view framework, we've added the ability to designate certain nodes as coming from a JSX view instead of coming from a PHP view with a associated mustache file. And then building on some work that Airbnb did to have a service that you pass all of the contextual data of the request and the JSX to a separate service that returns rendered markup. We then ship it to the client, and we've been working with the Preact team to come up with a Preact-based experience where there are different islands on the page that have been rendered on the server already, and then we come in and hydrate them on the client to then have you know, Preact/React take over and render it from there. Because, you know, it's a balance between, you want to be able to provide a really fast and performant experience. It's super important for all of our users. It's super important for SEO, but also, you know, being able to kind of go into the future and use these better frameworks to provide a better experience.
I want to just touch on something that I think is really fascinating there. Is you described an approach very similar to what, you know, Guillermo and Rita are describing, right? You know, hey, let's look at, you know, has the user already visited this? Is it hydrated? But you just declared about like 6 buzzwords from 2004, you know, mustache.js, jQuery, PHP. And up until this point, we haven't really talked about languages, right? In this future, open question, like, does it matter, right? Like, is there such thing as a fast language in the age of blending static content with dynamic content, running code at the edge, you know, edge of a CDN? Like, does it matter?
I'm biased, obviously, and I like the approach that we have taken and Rita has taken, which is JS is just phenomenal for, you know, this new era of adding dynamic bits here and there to different pieces of the pie. And it works tremendously well. You know, like a lot of people have said, obviously WebAssembly is super interesting, it's coming up, but the language starts mattering less for sure. And it's more about what is the right strategy that you're trying to implement. So what Katie was talking about is really interesting, because you have any programming language in the backend, and then as long as you can create that bridge to add dynamic content as you go, it's more about the strategy of, okay, I'm gonna hand off, I'm gonna pre-compute on the server, I'm gonna hydrate on the client, and that's all in the service of, okay, when you hydrate on the client, now you can create really cool experiences like animation, like using data from local storage, like real-time updates to the data. Like if you're doing a sale where stock is going down in real time, we couldn't do that with just PHP, right? We need to hydrate on the client, subscribe to a real-time data feed on the render on the server, subscribe to a real-time data feed on the client. So I think language is not interesting as much anymore, as much as what it is you want to accomplish. And JS already being on the browser side is just, you know, the perfect solution for right now. And WebAssembly, of course, is super interesting in the future.
I think it depends on the developer and the team and the organization a lot, right? So Workers as a platform primarily supports JavaScript, yeah, what we generally see when people ask to write other languages is like they have a whole team, right, that they hired specifically for a previous code base, and how do they get up to speed on this new technology? And so I think that's where WebAssembly becomes really interesting and will enable people not only to write things like Workers, but also will enable more developers to have access to writing things on the front end. I think this goes in the other direction as well, where as an independent developer or a small team or someone starting something from the ground up, I think what's happening is really, really enabling front-end developers, right? Where you can now, with something like Next, write a whole entire applications, and with serverless functions that support JavaScript, like now the backend becomes super accessible to you as well, right? Like the exact same language that you wrote the front end in, you're like, great, let me whip out this API, and all of a sudden you become a full stack developer.
I think just to like super emphasize that point, what I'm hearing from both of you is like, you know, it's not JavaScript about its inherent strengths as a language. It's about the ubiquity and the platforms that it support fundamentally, right? And if I have this correct, like even Cloudflare, like, yeah, it's JavaScript when you punch it in, but we just take that and you know, generate WebAssembly, and then it's something else on the other side. Like, you know, pretty cool. I want to go. We have a question from the audience, which I think is relevant since we have a bunch of experts here. That question is, you know, we should always try to keep loading time to a minimum, but, you know, as a developer, is there some goal I should strive towards? Like what is, you know, 1 millisecond sounds great. Should it be 500 milliseconds? Should it be 2 seconds? You know, is there an average experience that people should be thinking about when thinking about performance?
I think the interesting thing about performance is that when people say, "Oh, how fast should my page load?" Well, we have to really take the time to unpack, like, what does page load actually mean? And that's, I think, the really nice thing about Core Web Vitals, is because that's focusing more on the user's experience of, I have content in front of me. So I've had confirmation that what I want to see is what I'm starting to see. So that's first contentful paint. Largest contentful paint means that ideally the most important thing on the page is rendered in front of them and they can use it. And then other things like time to interactive or total blocking time, or measuring, okay, now the user can actually interact with the page. Because like, it doesn't matter if all of the content is there, but you're running a ton of JavaScript that's blocking the main thread, and the user tries to tap that buy a product button and it doesn't respond to them because the thread is locked up. So I think that's one of the exciting and interesting, but also like really difficult things about perf, is that it's hard to say, oh, well, here's one number that you look at, and that's the one number and the one target that you need to hit. It's really like a big picture of a bunch of different metrics, which is,
yeah. That's why I love what the efforts that Google has made into coming up with what's fundamentally heuristics, right? Because things like visual stability, I think we all agree that you can have something that loads really fast, but if it jitters 5 times and like then settles, it's not a good experience. So Web Vitals are embedding the right amount of subjectivity. There's this really obscure Japanese art form that I like to talk about, which is they prepare a brush and they put all the paint already in the brush, and then they draw a dragon in one stroke. So I think the Japanese word that stands for you paint a dragon in one stroke. That's how I think web performance we should think about it. So it's a continuum. It's very hard to just, okay, here's all the content, because Katie gave a great example of maybe some APIs are slower than others, right? So you have to start like painting this picture and then like neatly putting the content in front of the user in a way that's progressive and the layout is stable, etc. That's why, you know, static only is very hard to justify, because it's more of a stream of a combination of static and dynamic content that creates a good experience on the client side. But yeah, I think it's starting to answer the question more directly. I agree with Katie that started with Web Vitals as your measuring bar, but then do consider that there's a lot of subjectivity in there. Even the calculation of those metrics have a ton of heuristics in them. So just to give you an example, we just launched Next.js Analytics, which calculates what we call the real experiences score. And we call it real because Lighthouse is more synthetic and artificial. And they do a lot of stuff to like simulate load on your device and try to slow down your device, etc. But even that real experiences score has a great deal of subjectivity in it because of how Web Vitals are considered. And a good example of this is we all agree that when an image first loads, we like that blurry effect where like the image is first blurry, it's very fast, and then it smoothly converts into the definitive image. What we found recently with some experiments into embedding that into the Next.js image component, and it actually hurts largest contentful pane, and it hurts a lot of these metrics. And you would think as a developer, oh, my real experiences score went down, I must have done something wrong, but you actually were doing the right thing for your users. So my piece of advice would be, do consider web vitals, but also obviously there is a subjectivity of what's best for your business and your users.
Okay, we have about 5-6 minutes left. Because this is Future of Frontend, I want to like close on a future looking topic. You know, I think we have some technologies here that are interesting, right? Like, you know, pushing servers further and further to the edge. That feels very futuristic to me. When I saw that this year, I thought it blew me away. I played around with it. If you could put on your wizard hat and look 5 years, 10 years into the future, what does that look like? Are we back to just deploying massive single page applications that are like a gigabyte in size down to phones? Are we back on that train, or are we going somewhere else? Rita, I want to start with you.
Yeah,
I definitely have a.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I didn't hear Guillermo. I apologize.
Okay, go ahead, Rita.
All right. I was going to say I have a biased standpoint on this, but I think that actually the best solution to the debate between like client side or server side is like, how can you get things as close to your end user as possible, but get away from the device, right, which inherently might be less powerful. And so that's where the edge is becoming really, really powerful. And I think not just for applications and scalability, things like that. One of the things that we briefly mentioned here too was the personalization aspect of it. And that's where today a lot of things rely on render blocking and yeah, having that be able to be powered at the edge and rendered at the edge, and more things are moving towards server-side rendering. And as I like to call it, edge-side rendering. I think we'll see a lot of applications that are really powerful because they're more customizable that way.
So open question, future, you know, Katie, Guillermo, and maybe Katie, you could say like, what does the future look like at Etsy around this?
Yeah, I think you know, the future at Etsy is we're kind of doubling down on this infrastructure that we built, and I think it's going to really require a paradigm shift in how we think about web pages as a whole. I think Guillermo kind of talked about this pretty eloquently about how you know, it's not just a matter of just dumping everything to the client all at once, but really thinking about what is the most important content, how do we get that to the user faster, how do we allow them to interact with that faster, but then continuously build on their experience in such a way that you know, we're layering things on where they make sense and when they make sense. I think that a lot of engineers and developers aren't necessarily thinking about this idea of dynamic versus static really in depth, and you know, especially when we start talking about PWAs and service workers, when you're, you know, caching an app shell, and then you want to be able to have part of the page load instantly, but then other pieces of the page, maybe you go off and make a request from an API that returns back content that you're now rendering in the client. You know, thinking about your pages and breaking them up into sections where the differentiator is how dynamic is this content versus how do I get this content to the screen, I think is a different way of thinking that I see a lot of folks are moving towards. And you know, I think that goes really well with microservices, and you know, really the server is becoming the API, and the client is in many ways becoming your server that renders your pages. And I think it's really, really exciting and interesting, all the stuff that Rita was talking about with doing actual cloud, you know, doing edge computing to get that out faster and closer to your users is really exciting. So lots of cool stuff happening.
Yeah, for us, I think we want balancing the investment that goes into developer experience with giving instant feedback to the developer, with, you know, this end goal of maximizing end user performance, and always starting with, I want to create a delightful experience. Here's how I do it with code, and then sort of infrastructure becomes invisible. I think that's one of our primary goals and visions for the future. I think the other one that's really important to bring up is balancing the increase and obvious need for privacy with, these technologies, like where are the users' needs and requirements, and where does the other side of the equation and the needs of the business start and end. I think it's going to be really important. Like one funny thing that hurts largest contentful paint a lot is a GDPR pop-up that comes in later and shifts the page and things like that, And the problem is not the GDPR pop-up itself, is we haven't really taken that as a building block of our page, and therefore we thought we sort of tucked it in later, and then it ruined everything. So I think that's an apt metaphor for where we're in. We're still growing a lot as an industry. We have to put the user first. We have to have this coherent rendering pipeline that kind of encapsulates all these concerns. And I think it's going to take the entire industry to collaborate and make this make every aspect of this better.
Cool. Hey, I learned something here today that even I wasn't thinking of, which was the role of personalization. I think that if I had a takeaway that was like a theme that came up repeatedly, is like, hey, we talked about pre-rendering content, or maybe we've struck this balance about we need to have some things pre-rendered, we need to have some stuff dynamic, and then maybe that the thing that we're all going to be talking about, all the developer advocates take note, is how do I segment off these bits for different users, some of that being pre-computed, some of that being optimized at render time, and maybe that's where the dialogue will go. Hadn't really thought about it. I don't work on a product like Etsy, which is really cool. Or even the idea of how can AI play a role in thinking about how to personalize things ahead of time before someone even knows that they want to be there. So that feels like a good closing note. I want to thank all my panelists for being here. Rita, Guillermo, Katie, it's been a great conversation. And thank you so much. Thanks, audience.
Thank you.
Thank you all.